It's a short one. It's called "Why Trigger Warnings Are Actually Harmful." I saw this video on Stardust's stream. I popped in real quick and I saw she's watching that, and I was like, "Oh, this might be interesting."
Like Mac.
This is Stardust right here, and so now I'm going to react to it, and I'm going to place this video up as an independent video reaction, which is something you should be doing as well, Stardust. I'm sorry, I don't mean to bully Stardust at all. It's just like, post your reactions. Expand your career, guys. Advocate for yourselves. Spam content until people start recognizing you. Okay? That's my recommendation as a content creator. Anyway, why trigger warnings are actually harmful. Okay, I don't know how a trigger warning could be harmful. Fundamentally speaking, a trigger warning can be like a good thing. We do trigger warnings all the time. Like in the beginning of the show in the movie Jackass, there's like a trigger warning of like, hey, this stuff's pretty crazy. Don't try it at home. I would consider that to an extent a trigger warning, as long as it's warranted. You know, if you're going to talk about something that's like very intense, it might be good to be like, hey, like, trigger warning, we're going to talk about a very sensitive topic. So if you identify with that topic and that might be some kind of a traumatic experience for you, then like, I get it. You know, it's more of just like a warning. Fundamentally, I don't know what part of it can be toxic or or harmful. I can see the point where people say trigger warning, eating disorder, and someone's like, I forgot to eat a meal today, and like, then some people go a little crazy with it. But yeah, triggered by trigger warnings. True, very true.
Hi guys, it's Misha, and welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be
talking. Oh, this is called Misha Petrov, is their name.
Talking about trigger warnings and how they're harmful to trauma survivors and actually pose a threat to academic freedom.
Why are they harmful to trauma survivors?
I even have an emotional support animal with me here. This is Vanya.
Okay.
So the purpose of these trigger warnings, according to these college professors, is to create a safe space for the students and to warn them about the material to avoid reminding them of any past trauma. And
yeah, like it's getting them ready to be in for a wild ride.
I didn't start to see trigger warnings being used until later on in high school, and then in almost all of my classes in university. They were all over the place. And speaking from experience, these trigger warnings really do limit the discussion and what the professor is able to teach. Everyone is walking on eggshells and is too afraid to ask the questions that they want to ask, because what if that's the wrong question? What if that offends somebody?
Listen, like that, okay, I'm not in school, they are, so, obviously, but the trigger warning itself isn't the problem then here. The problem here would be the feeling of walking on eggshells if that is actually happening. That is independent from a trigger warning. If anything, the trigger warning is like, hey guys, I'm about to fuck you up. We're going to talk about some fucking raunchy shit. Be ready for it. The trigger warning existence fundamentally has nothing to do with censoring material. If anything, it's telling you we're not censoring material. Hey guys, we're going to be going through some crazy banana stuff. So these two, if this is actually a problem in high school, which I don't know if it is, or college or wherever she's in, which it very well may be, it's independent from the trigger warning itself.
So it already creates a weird environment where no one really wants to say anything. And it really does make students appear very fragile. And this is especially funny to me, someone that grew up with, fairy tales that never came with a trigger warning. I'm sure other Russian people or German people, because German fairy tales are also very dark.
There once was a boy who liked to suck his thumbs. His mother asked him to stop, but he wouldn't.
Wait, this is from Family Guy.
So she cut off his thumbs. Now he has no thumbs. Good night.
I think, okay, that's a Family Guy bit there.
Relate, because when your mom's reading you a fairy tale, she doesn't give you a trigger warning, Baba Yaga's about to boil a kid.
Do they actually tell these types of stories to kids in Russia?
That trigger warning would have taken away the element of surprise, kind of like a spoiler. So that's why it doesn't work. And
all right, now trigger warnings are spoiler warnings. Okay. Spoiler warning, the kid dies. Okay. I mean, I would say that Baba Yaga, Family Guy's a very reliable source. I would say that that story. So let's say there's like a very intense story. I think if a parent tells the kid the very intense story, that's their prerogative. But I don't think that, like, would you say that story is appropriate for elementary school or whatever, kids school, 5-year-old school? Why is the words are escaping me right now? You'd probably be like, yeah, I don't think you should tell a story about someone getting eaten alive to children. But if the parents want to tell that story, that's okay, right? We would understand that. And so that's kind of where we get to the separation here. Additionally, 5-year-old kids hearing that story is not the same as like an 18-year-old who's older and probably has an exponentially higher chance of actually having a triggering topic or something that could trigger them, like some kind of a trauma. And then also the source material is going to be more mature. So like if we're having, if the class is like, hey guys, this is a little bit of a trigger warning before we talk about this topic, we're going to talk about sexual assault. Okay. Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I think it's even reasonable to go like, listen, if you're somebody that might be offended by this, you can also like leave the room. There are some concessions like that are made in middle school. They do that for some religious people as well. In some instances, very like limited, right? And I think it's reasonable for like somebody to want to walk away from that material. Now, if they start using trigger warning, we're going to talk about police officers, then we're probably shitting and coming. You know what I mean? We're at that point. I think that then we're just being so ridiculous. You know what I mean?
In the classroom now, you have to avoid topics that could be upsetting, and then professors avoid teaching it, obviously. But
yeah, that's independent of trigger warnings, though. That's a different conversation.
How can you avoid talking about violence, especially in a history class, for example? You have to learn about disturbing things such as the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide. Like, these are all very important things we have to learn and have to discuss, even if they are obviously very upsetting. Can you imagine a president?
Sure, I agree with that. I remember somewhat recently they were talking. I had the conversation with my mom maybe 6 months ago. We're talking about how there was a consideration in schools to ban like books about the World War II and like the Holocaust, and they were like, yeah, it's just too much for a child to learn. It's too intense. I'm like, fuck that shit. Teach a 14-year-old that some dumb piece of shit rose to power because not for nothing, World War II happened because we, specifically as Americans, I'm not trying to be an asshole, absolutely decimated the German economy because of World War I to such a degree that it put people in a position where they were willing to elect a literal fucking sociopath. And of course, that sociopath is fucking literal Satan, embodied, and they killed like 6 million Jews, right? And I think like 4 million non-Jewish people, right? We need to learn that very harsh truth. However, if you said, hey, before we start the topic, I think that, can you please tell my child that this is going to be very intense like subject material? Then I would say, sure, that's a reasonable. But they shouldn't be like shying away from these topics is different from triggering or some kind of a warning that this topic is going to be very intense. I wish people would give me trigger warnings for flashlights, for flashing lights, like people with epilepsy like me. Yeah, I respect that. Definitely need that trigger warning. Trigger warning. What if I had a flashlight here and I just started flickering it? You'd probably have a goddamn seizure, dude.
President asking for a trigger warning before looking at what's going on in a war. Like, you have to see it also, because that elicits that emotional response, right? That you wouldn't get necessarily if someone just told you about what's going on rather than...
For sure, and you need to experience that emotional response so that in the future you know that it's horrific and to avoid going down like roads like that would lead to another Holocaust.
You looking at it at a documentary or something like that. And I think it's one thing for a professor to write in their syllabus, this is what we're going to be discussing, or kind of tell kids that. And I think it's one thing for a professor to write in their syllabus, this is what we're going to be discussing, or kind of tell kids this movie or this documentary has a lot of gore. But these trigger warnings are not just used in those cases. They're
That's what a trigger warning is. So they agree that trigger warnings are reasonable.
Used when there's a bad word or when there's a drop of blood in this movie that we're going to watch for.
Well, yeah, I mean, like a trigger warning, we're going to fucking like listen, 50-year-old white English teacher about to read The Catcher in the Rye. Don't call on me to read the N-word parts. Is this The Catcher in the Rye? There's like books with so many explicit N-words. Like trigger warning, that's a reasonable hey guys, we're reading this book and there's going to be some pro gamer words in here. So watch out. That's reasonable. I'd say we should start saying we should start saying N, not really say the full word, but hey, listen, maybe I'm just too sensitive. But yeah, there's something reasonable. Hey, there's going to be blood in this. Okay. Hey, there's going to be pro gamer words in this trigger warning. Okay, I think those are reasonable trigger warnings. Because if you're giving the warning, that means you're talking about it. To Kill a Mockingbird. That's what I was thinking of, right? Of Mice and Men. Why do all these books have the N-word in it, supposedly? What the fuck? Oh, yeah, no, Papa Gut's Diary. Yeah, trigger warning, guys. Pro gamer words.
3 seconds, or, a slur or something like that. It's everywhere. Everything has a trigger warning.
Bible.
Yeah, movie ratings are literal trigger warnings. True.
They're given trigger warnings, but
It's everywhere. Everything has a trigger warning.
Bible, Shakespeare, they're given trigger warnings, but I
Are they giving trigger warnings in the Bible and Shakespeare? Like, is that true? I mean, what is they giving trigger warnings on? Suicide? Like, okay, I guess that's fine. Like, whatever. I don't really care. I feel like it's not that big of a deal if they do that. Okay.
You wrote the U.S. Constitution. What are you triggering that?
There are trigger warnings for the U.S. Constitution now. We've seen trigger warnings for American flags because it evokes patriotic imagery and it may be hurtful to people that aren't of American descent.
Students are
personally, I've never seen that. That's preposterous. Of course, if you're trigger warning like the Bible or the Constitution or America or the American flag, that's what I was saying before. That's unrealistic. Is that actually happening? That I'd have to look into. If that's happening, that's absolutely preposterous. Jesus.
given the option to just leave class. You don't have to learn about it if it could offend you. I mean,
I feel like there's some things that like are reasonable that you may not have to sit through the class. That depends on what it is. Like obviously you need to watch like the Holocaust shit. Especially since it's just a night. Sometimes they just put on Schindler's List for three Schindler's List for 3 classes, and boom, bada bing, bada boom. You don't even have to do any work. Did National Archives put harmful language alert on the U.S. Constitution? Oh, it's mostly true. That's what Snopes is saying. Yeah, I think that's kind of a sussy thing to do. They put banners on. I mean, I guess it's not that big of a deal, but that is also like showing way too much sensitivity, in my opinion. Let's see. But the newly installed warnings are taken out of context. While it issued that the alert appeared as a banner on the digital records and the website's the catalog, including the nation's founding documents, the warning was not connected to any specific document, but was instead provided as a blanket statement regarding potentially harmful language in any document. After the statement appeared on the digital archives, some clarification. What's the clarification? Were there any pro gamer words? It may contain some content that may be harmful or difficult to review. NARA's records span the history of the United States and are charged to preserve students. Some of the materials presented here may reflect outdated, biased, offensive, or impossibly violent views and opinions in addition. So, well, maybe they're referring to like some of the stuff about Native American. I don't really know. Such context and items that may be reflect racism, sexism, or xenophobic opinions, or be discriminatory against views on sexuality, gender, and religion. Okay, I mean, I guess that makes sense, especially with the racist, sexist, or xenophobic opinions. Okay, I mean, it sounds like maybe it's reasonable to have a slight warning on there for some kind of an intense word, but okay.
That's ridiculous. It is so ridiculous. You are going into university, accept the fact that you may be uncomfortable sometimes. That's part of being an adult, right? And if you can't handle that, I mean, what, you're gonna have to sit in your room all day long, because life, like the real world, is not a safe space, right?
Sure.
This is a fantasy that we're creating in the classroom. The only
Well, that's not entirely true. Like, there's a mix between, like, right? Like, so the real world, to an extent, is kind of a safe space, right? We have police officers, right? So there's a level we understand that we should be safe to what degree. Now we're having a conversation on what that degree is. Yeah. So, sure. I can see why in some cases people might want to do trigger warnings.
The only place you'll find this is probably TikTok or other social media apps where they put trigger warnings everywhere. I don't know if you've seen, it's like TW. You need to be able to talk about serious issues as a college student.
But I will say, like, those people, I don't know what they're talking about. Trigger warning depression. See, I find that to be, like, ridiculous. Like, that's just trigger warning. I give you attention. They might be attention seeking, but they're still talking about that. Even if I don't like any of these
everywhere
people, mostly for some reason women, trigger warning everything. I don't know. Maybe the topics that they're talking about are more intense than I think. I don't know why this person's face is cut off. I wonder. That seemed explicit. Why did you remove their face?
Seen, it's like TW.
Only because everybody else is in there. Why did you financial abuse trigger warning? What? Why did you cut
TikTok
that one?
TikTok or other social media apps where they put trigger warnings everywhere. I don't know.
What was the motivation for this? Sorry, I know it's a minor detail. I just don't understand why they did that. Weird. Anyway, they're still talking about the sensitive topic here, even though they're trigger warning it, right? So, like, if anything, they kind of, like, you know, it debunks your argument a little bit.
If you've seen, it's like TW. You need to be able to talk about serious issues as a college student, and that may mean getting offended or getting a little bit triggered.
Sure.
Like, that's just part of it. That's life. If you have some severe trauma that you need to work through, go to therapy. There's no shame in that. You know, I know not everyone can, but if that is an option, go to therapy. A lot of universities have counseling, but it should not be the professor's responsibility if you have a panic attack every time you see the color red. It's these
Well, that's a little bit of a disproportionate thing that the way that you're presenting that.
Schools that are afraid to get sued, and then the rest of us have to, walk on eggshells and be afraid of saying the wrong thing and this and that, and then treating everyone as a child. We are actual adults in college. And the funny part is this doesn't even help those who have experienced trauma. By starting off class by saying, hey, what we're about to watch, what we're about to read might emotionally traumatize you. Who do you think that's helping?
Well, that's not what a trigger warning is. It's trigger warnings aren't usually saying, hey, this might traumatize you. Trigger warnings are usually for the people that it would trigger, right? So if we were going to have a really graphic conversation about, I don't know, say sexual assault, I guess, and you said trigger warning sexual assault, I'm not gonna have a trauma. I'm not gonna create a trauma by watching somebody talk about a horrific sexual assault experience. I might be upset and emotionally provoked, but which is a good thing. Because that's obviously it's a very sensitive topic. But I'm not gonna get offended. It's not gonna generate a trauma in me. You don't really understand what a trigger warning is. Trigger warning is for somebody who was sexually assaulted, and they would be like, "Oh, this might be too much for me to engage with because I have a horrible trauma. I'd like to leave the room." I think that's perfectly reasonable. And very clearly that person doesn't need to have a conversation about how horrific a sexual assault is, right? So what you're saying you don't seem to understand what a trigger warning is.
What we're about to watch, what we're about to read might emotionally traumatize you. Who do you think that's helping? Those people are already prepared to be triggered. And there was even a Harvard study, right, where they looked at trauma survivors and these trigger warnings. And what they found is that they are actually counter-therapeutic and that they hold them back from recovery, from getting better. And this is so obvious.
What? Hold on.
Actually counter-therapeutic, where they looked at those people are already prepared to be triggered. And there was even a Harvard study, right, where they looked at trauma survivors and these trigger warnings. And what they found is that they are actually counter-therapeutic and that they hold them back from recovery, from getting better. And this is so obvious. If you know anything about trauma, if you tell everyone...
Okay. Harvard expert warns trigger warnings could be doing more harm than good. A Harvard professor is warning using the term trigger warning may itself trigger the negative reaction it is intended to prevent. New psychologists' research suggests that not only do trigger warnings not work, but they could also have the opposite effect in some cases. Harvard Law said this is incredibly vague. I need a little bit more than maybe. This is all maybes. It says a new psychological research suggests that trigger warnings don't work, but they could also have the opposite effect. That's not nearly enough. I need a little bit more information about this. The first random controlled experiment designed to examine the effects of trigger warnings on individual resilience may indicate that Greg something and whatever, I can't read them, were right about trigger warnings. In fall of 2015, this Greg, First Amendment lawyer and president of the founding of Individual Rights and Education, for which I work, and social... Okay, this might be a little bit too in favor of that person. But let's just read this. I published an article in The Atlantic. It details how college campuses may inadvertently promote mental habits identical to cognitive distortions. Let's see. Our intentional mental filters or biases that increase our misery, fuel our anxiety, and make us feel bad about ourselves. What is that? Cognitive distortions. Our internal mental filter. Okay. Therapists teach their clients to recognize and overcome. The PAR argued that some campus practices, presumably intended to protect students from being harmed by words and ideas deemed offensive or distressing, seem to be interfering with students' ability to get along with each other and could be having a disastrous effect. Mental health among those practices is training students to identify microaggressions. This has absolutely nothing to do with fucking trigger warnings. I could understand this. This makes sense. Them saying, if we focus too much on microaggressions, that you could start to, have basically bad faith interpretations of everybody's movements and actions. 100%. That part makes sense to me. If you're if this person says this about you, if you compliment, hey, listen, and listen, I'm going to be a little provocative, and I'm sorry. Hey, listen, trigger warning. Hey, listen, black women, if somebody compliments your hair, they might be having a microaggression where they're supposed to be oh, that's weird. You know what I mean? If somebody's oh, your hair looks nice, and you happen to have hair that doesn't align with Western beauty standards, I feel like sometimes that's oh, that's a microaggression because my hair is different, and I can't believe you're complimenting my hair, and now it just seems like you're pointing it out and you're trying to offend me. It's sometimes people are just trying to be nice. I could see that argument, but that has nothing to do with trigger warnings. And you can't just bring trigger warnings into conversations about microaggressions and focusing too much on race. Race is important from a societal perspective, obviously, but on an individual level, it's not. We should be trying to treat each other as if race doesn't matter individually, while acknowledging like systemic aspects from a societal perspective. That's the way that you're supposed to go in for that. Okay. Turning classrooms and lecture halls into intellectual safe spaces where students are protected from words and ideas that they find upsetting. See, again, this isn't trigger warnings. And the issuing of trigger warnings about potentially triggering content written in films. Okay. So these are three separate ideas here. It's too much conversation around about like being hyper vigilant of like microaggressions and hyper vigilant about different identities in a way that could be toxic and force people to over-identify with their identities and over-police every single interaction that they have. I get that one. I can agree with that. Protecting students, like doing like intellectual safe spaces where you hold back on talking about certain content, I agree with that as well. That's a bad thing. You shouldn't be doing that. But trigger warnings that's a totally separate topic, and you can't force all three into the category and then say trigger warnings are bad as well. The trigger warning is a solid compromise to not talking about harsh ideas. It's like, hey, we're going to talk about something intense. And to be honest with you, I'm pretty sure we heard stuff like that when we talked about like the Holocaust and stuff when I was in school. So this study very clearly is a little, it shouldn't have boxed it in. Just on the fundamentals, I can't see any, like, I don't see the triggering part. The trigger itself is not harmful. The trigger itself is not harmful, but someone that is something a person's environment that reminds them of past trauma. The thinking behind using trigger warnings is that for people who have experienced trauma, distress will be reduced by warning them about the possible ways in which they could be triggered. Sure. By content that could remind them of their traumatic experiences. The warning ostensibly allows them to mentally prepare for the challenge. Yeah, for sure. Severe emotional reaction triggered by course material is significant. The signal that the student needs to prioritize mental health and obtain evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapies. Yeah, sure, I agree that they need to see therapists, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be sensitive to people that might have a trauma. Severe emotional reactions are not an indication that the professors or others should warn students in advance that the material could be triggering for those with PTSD, nor that potentially triggering material should be removed. Well, no, it shouldn't be removed. I don't see any solid, reasonable, or argument about not using trigger warnings here. Okay, so that's just silly.
Around you, hey, don't say this word or don't do this because this is a trigger for me. It gives that trigger and that trauma so much power.
When you have a little kid who goes to the doctor and he's about to get a shot, and the doctor is like prepping him, saying this is gonna be horrible, prepare yourself, nurse, hold him down, the kid's gonna freak out, and they say, oh my gosh, this is gonna hurt so bad. Whereas opposed to the doctor would just treat the kid like an adult and say, hey, we're just gonna give you a quick shot, there you go. The kid realizes, hey, it wasn't that bad. It's like that with trigger warnings. When you tell someone this is going to offend you, people look for any opportunity they can to be offended. They're going to act like they have PTSD over reading some hurtful words.
Right. So like now we're engaging in like everybody who wants a trigger warning is just a crybaby. Some of them could be. First, oh my God. So anytime when you're a kid, you go to the doctor, a lot of times they will say like, hold still, we're going to prick you a little bit, but it's not going to be that bad. It'll be okay. That's the right way that you engage in this topic. Also, but just keep in mind, children are different than adults. There's a difference between a kid being a little afraid of needles versus like a woman who is violently raped, not necessarily wanting to participate in a conversation about sexual assault, or at the very least being mentally prepared. This is dumb. This is dumb. This person is dumb. This is just like anti woke. I guess it's like anti woke culture, but more than that, it's just anti like common sense. Like they're going with these extreme examples of why you should never be able to be like, hey, bro, this might be a little much. Like, or the fundamentals of like having a little trigger warning is fine. You could have conversations about it going too far, but this is just like dumb. Like, this stuff is so stupid. Like, what the fuck? I swear, people are literally triggered by a trigger warning. They're triggered by everything. Like, it's just like mental gymnastics to just not be a little bit more sensitive to people in society. It's a little silly. Yeah, could you imagine you just shoot the kid without giving them a warning? Yeah, you can't do that. Well, give him a shot. If you don't give a kid a warning, they're going to get a shot. They're going to fucking thrash around, and then the needle might break inside of their leg or inside their body. Like if you're gonna take blood, see, like if you're just gonna put it in the fat layer, it's a little bit easier. You pop it in, boom, you're done. If they have to potentially take a kid's blood, you have to be a little bit more. You have to be like, hey, listen, kid, we're going. You have to stay still, and then they're gonna be upset, but they have to like prepare for that. You have to give somebody a warning for that. I wonder if this guy's ever been to a fucking doctor. But okay.
Your trauma is an essential part of who you are, and it's your identity.
Guess.
How are you expecting?
That's just no. You what?
Hurtful words.
Your trauma is an essential part of who you are.
Your trauma is part of you, and it has helped craft you for better or for worse. Sure.
And it's your identity.
It's not your identity. I don't know. I would never tell a trauma survivor that like their traumatic experience is their identity. That just seems to me to communicate a fundamental misunderstanding of traumatic experience. Because now you're kind of dealing people who are traumatized that like their trauma defines them as a person, and that's the opposite of what we're trying to communicate to people that are trauma survivors. Real trauma, not like bullshit trauma, right? Trigger warning, my mommy washed my mouth out with soap. I know that's considered abuse now, but come on.
How are you expected to move on from that? It's about 3.5% of the U.S. population that has PTSD. But if we're just talking about trauma, a lot of us have trauma. Not PTSD, but just trauma, right?
Sure.
And so a lot of things can make us uncomfortable.
Sure. So it's good to give you a little warning before we engage in a topic that might make you a little uncomfortable or trauma. We're not even talking about uncomfortable. We're really talking about traumatic. But sure, it's still fine to prep somebody for an uncomfortable conversation.
It's life. There's even something called exposure therapy, which is great, especially for people who have phobias, because then you can be exposed to certain sounds or smells.
Hey guys, I have a phobia of being raped. Like, well, I don't understand the argument here. Like, exposure therapy doesn't work for everybody. It's not. Exposure therapy for somebody who was sexually assaulted would. I know. I'm sorry if I'm leaning so much onto that specific argument, but I'm sorry for trigger warning. But like the exposure therapy there would be like just being exposed to men if you were a woman who was assaulted, and women if you were a male who was assaulted, maybe. But yeah, you just don't really know what you're talking. Like this person just doesn't really know what they're talking about. It seems like they have like an idea that they don't like trigger warnings, and now they're just like throwing words at exposure therapy. It's like, okay, yeah, that can work for some treatments, but like even exposure therapy is done with a trigger warning. Hey. Hey, I know a fish used to nibble at your toes as a baby because you were left in a pool of water. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a fish in your hands. Are you ready? Yeah, I'm ready for the fish. Right? You give a trigger warning to somebody going through exposure therapy. It's silly. Okay.
Smells or whatever, colors that can trigger you. It's a potential trigger. And
what?
To certain sounds or smells or whatever, colors that can trigger you. It's a potential trigger, and become, used to it and to move on and to heal. More and more teachers are implementing these trigger warnings to be politically correct. And
I think that they're implementing them to try to be a little bit nicer. Sometimes being nice isn't a virtue signal, guys. Hot take. Now, if you do a trigger warning, when again, like if you're like trigger warning, guys, we're going to talk about police officers. Now you're being fucking preposterous. But if I do a trigger warning on like, Nazi genocide, I think it's reasonable to say, hey kids, listen, this is a very sensitive subject material. We're going to be talking about this mass genocide that led to the death of 10 million people. Plus, kids should hear that. They should hear that, right? That's a trigger warning, right? But it's like you need to learn this, but be prepared because this is going to be unsettling. It's just a preparation. It's totally normal. Yeah, not all traumas need exposure therapy. Exactly. Exposure therapy, hot take, is conducted by mental health professionals. Teachers are not mental health professionals. That's why it's not the teacher's responsibility to work through your trauma, but I think it should be their responsibility to prepare you for a very sensitive topic. And if it truly is an incredibly triggering moment, maybe allow you to walk away from some of the course material. Obviously not like the Holocaust, but again, other very sensitive personal topics. I could understand that, right?
And it's just so unfortunate. We're allowing students to have this utopian view of the world where nothing upsetting ever happens, which just isn't reality. Not preparing students for...
Well, again, if you're going to trigger warning somebody, you're not giving them the idea that stuff's going to happen. Like nothing bad's going to happen. You're just preparing them for a bad thing.
For real life. And that's all for today's video, guys. Please comment down below your thoughts on trigger warnings, and remember to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss any of my videos, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.
Okay. I mean, I disagree. I think trigger warnings are fine. I think that unless they're overly sensitive trigger warnings, those are silly. That's it. I feel like that's pretty much it. Okay. I was triggered by that trigger warning video.
I want Papa Gut to pee on my face, but just as a friend. There's nothing weird about that. I want him to pee on my face.